Glad you're here. So welcome to the SVA MA Design Research Department, and welcome to the first of our fall lecture series. Really excited to kick off and excited to have you here. My name is Molly Heinz. I'm the new co-chair of the department here, along with our co-chair and founding chair, Alice Twimlow, who is here in spirit, joining us from Amsterdam, where she is located now. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of a preview of the rest of the lectures we're having this fall, in case you haven't seen the announcement. We've got a great lineup and a really diverse crowd, a really great group of younger, energetic lecturers, and a couple of people from far afield, like October 27th, we've got Marco Ferrari here from Milan, who's in town for a few weeks working on a research project with the Guggenheim. And then I want to draw your attention to November 10th, which is our open house. And that evening, we won't have just one lecturer. We'll actually be hearing from some of our very esteemed faculty and alums and students. And we have a couple of alums here this evening who I wanted to introduce as well. Alan Rapp is here, and he is actually Michael Kubo's editor. And you'll hear more about the book they worked on together momentarily. So November 10th, open house. What we'll talk about there is a variety of things, but we'll talk about how we see design, which is everything from tie-dye to toast and whatever's in between. So we treat design very broadly, and that makes it pretty exciting in terms of what gets covered and studied and researched here. Just a quick snapshot of what's happening in the department over the course of a year. The MA program is 1 year or 2 semesters, or in an academic year, 9 months. We have some great scholarship funding currently, and we get out and about, lots of site visits, lots of people coming in to the department to lecture, and then we're very busy. The main focus for the students is their thesis project. And we have most of our graduate students, we have 13 graduate students in the class this year, most of whom are here tonight. And just a quick note that our grad students will be encouraged to ask questions to the lecturer, and their questions will get priority because they're here to practice asking questions too. So hope they have some good ones ready. Just a quick snapshot of our faculty, some of our core faculty up in the top half, and then we are also really fortunate to have great adjunct faculty who work with us on a regular basis. You can find out more about our faculty on our website. And just another quick snapshot of what we're actually working on when we get here. Everything from news stories to feature stories to presentations to profiles, and really the tools that help us achieve those, reporting, interviewing, archival research out on the field and in the field and pounding the pavement. Applying to the program is fairly straightforward and simple. 5 easy steps. We need your transcripts, we need a letter of recommendation, we need a written statement from you about why you're interested, and ideally also a writing sample of your work that can be something published or unpublished, and a resume. The deadline is technically rolling, but we give priority to applications that come in by January 15th. And you can find out more on our website, which is designresearch.sva.edu. Always changing and wild and wacky. And tonight after the lecture, I invite you to come back to our studio, which is kind of our home base where we work, and join us for drinks and snacks and continue the conversation there. So without further ado, let me introduce this evening's lecturer, Michael Kubo. He is multifaceted, and one word cannot encapsulate everything he does. So he is an author, curator, architect, and he is completing his Ph.D. in the Department of History, Theory, and Criticism of Architecture at MIT. So he joins us from Cambridge today. And he, in addition to working on that, Michael is the co-author, I think the copy of the book here. New book, HeroiC, Concrete Architecture in the New Boston, which he'll talk a little bit more about. And that's coming out with Monacelli Press in just a couple of weeks. And in addition to this project, Michael is a collaborator with the interdisciplinary practice Over Under. His more recent exhibitions include Imagining the Modern, and he is involved in the Design Biennial Boston and Inform Communicating Boston at the Boston Society of Architects. And he was also curator for OfficeUS at the US Pavilion at the 2014 International Architecture Biennale in Venice, which was a pretty gigantic endeavor that brought together many, many people and offices, and he'll tell you more about that as well. In addition, Michael's own writing and research and writing studies architectural practices in the United States after World War II. And his writing has appeared in the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, the Journal of Architectural Education, Harvard Design Magazine, at MAS Context, at the Boston Globe, Architect, ArchitectureBoston, Volume, and CLOG. And that is not all. This is just a fraction of what Michael has done, because I actually knew Michael's name well before I ever met him. He was a member of the editorial team for Rem Koolhaus at his firm OMA, and when I moved to New York in the early 2000s, the architects I was working with would always say to me, check out this by Kubo, or have you met Kubo? And it was like, Kubo, Kubo, Kubo. And I was like, who is this guy, Michael Kubo? And you know, already in my mind, he was kind of a legend in the making, and becoming heroic himself. And so today he's going to talk about shifting platforms in a single bound. So please join me in welcoming Michael Kubo.
Oh man, okay. Thank you. I was not expecting that. That was a very unusually nice and, like no pressure introduction. Thank you to Molly, and thank you to everybody at SVA for inviting me. It's really a nice opportunity to come and show you guys for the first time some of the new stuff that we've been working on, and in a way also to revisit, in sort of thinking through how things related to each other, to think through some of the older things that, it's good to sort of take a new look at for me. So I should start, you guys can hear me okay? Okay, so I should start by sort of at the beginning. And I should say that a lot of this talk, you're going to see that it's basically about sort of promiscuity between formats, and it's about sort of an interest in certain kinds of historical material that we just kind of keep, hashing over again and again, but also an interest in certain types of formats, editorial formats and curatorial formats that tend to involve a lot of content that migrates from one thing to another, or that can start in one domain and then can end up in another, or in both, or in sort of totally other formats, sort of as we go. And there's a certain relationship between the body of architectural and historical and cultural stuff that we've been interested in, and then where they end up sort of playing out on the ground. And a major vehicle that sort of started that process in motion for me was really starting to work in Boston at pinkcomma, which is this gallery that I direct together with Mark Pasnick and Chris Grimley. And it's really become kind of the space that spawned a lot of this ability to start thinking about something and then testing it in one space and then sort of watch it migrate into various spaces. So we've been in existence, we've all been working together since 2009, which is also when I moved to Boston and started the Ph.D. I'm a native Bostonian before that, but that's maybe neither. Well, we can talk about that when we get to HeroiC, whether that's here or there. We've done since then, at least, it's probably now up to 40 shows of various different types. I mean, sort of more art gallery type shows, more architectural research-based shows. But the first thing that we worked on together when I came in 2009 was a project called Publishing Practices that was actually based on research. Woo, this is good. I'll try not to lean on this thing. Was based on research that I had done while I was doing a Banham Fellowship at the University of Buffalo in the year before that. And it was research on architects as publishers, essentially. So it was trying to build up a history over the last 100 plus years of the ways in which architects had operated. Many of the most famous architects had operated equally so as editors, publishers of various types of things, sort of newspapers, books, serial books, pamphlets, manifestos, sort of a whole range of things. And it was about trying to do research on the ways that those things related to or didn't relate to strategically their architectural practice. And so there's a certain kind of assumption that we tend to inherit that, you know, the architects are interested in a very tight relationship between their buildings and then the things that they write or sort of publish or say about the work that they do or about architecture in general. And this kind of proceeded from the opposite position, which was that those things are most architects that have been equally operative as publishers and as sort of editors of various types and as authors have understood that space to be strategically distinct from and sort of different from the space in which they produce their buildings, and that they consider them, let's say, equally architectural. They consider both of them to be kind of acts of producing architectural things within the discourse, sort of if architecture is understood as a field of cultural production rather than just buildings, right? And so the core of this was a series of 10 case studies, which were really the 10 sort of what we identified as, or thought of as kind of the canonical books over the last 100 years, kind of canonical understood in the conventional sense. Like if you took a slice through the discipline at a certain historical moment, you would find this book, you know, at a particular time on everybody's desk, you know, kind of almost universally, right? So towards new architecture, Gideon, Space-Time and Architecture, the Le Corbusier Complete Works, etc., all the way through until sort of the ones that you would imagine would be the contemporary ones. And so in each case, let's see if I have a pointer. So you can see that graphically the structure, this is a timeline, sort of chronologically from somewhere right between 1914 or thereabouts up until 2014, so it was a 100-year time frame. And for each book, there's this kind of splaying out of sort of the book itself, and then spreads, sort of trying to understand graphically what the kind of project of the book was or how it functioned. And then before and sort of after material that was color-coded. So Space-Time and Architecture, in this color coding, these are all the things by Gideon or sort of influences that get sort of invoked and, you know, at their moments in time, and that then sort of get coalesced into some of the things that are happening in Space-Time and Architecture, and then it sort of spins off, you know, mechanization takes command, and a series of other kind of products sort of distributed in time. So it was to kind of like thicken the sense of all the things that are flowing through a certain book once it gets produced, right? In some cases, studios, other sorts of influent books that they're sort of chewing through and restaging in certain ways, etc. And the sort of part two of the project was a survey of about 500 people, asking them questions about basically what role books played in their disciplinary formation, what did they think was going to happen to the architectural book in the future. This is 2009, sort of a different moment than it was now, when it was very much on the table, this kind of endless debate about, you know, the future of the book, which has kind of mutated in the meantime. But also some interesting results, like, are books a valid form of architectural production? And, you know, the majority of people said, you know, more or less what our sense would have been, but we didn't know that that was universally or sort of generally shared so much, that books and buildings were both seen as kind of equal parts of the discourse. And so we mapped all of this in this sort of city of books, which is also a chronology of all of the books. We asked people as part of the survey to list the 5 books that were the most formative for them. So not necessarily canonical, but basically if your top 5, basically, if you were on a desert island and you had 5 books, or 5 books that were the most influential for each person. And then we graphed them. So these are all the books, each one sort of by year, from 2014 back. And then the stack is the number of times that they listed any given book, right? So this is 2010, sort of when we did it. And I'll leave you to imagine which one this is, right? So this would be about 1995. There may have been just a recent issue of JAE entirely about this book, and then the same sort of list at the bottom, and then sort of displayed it. So this was the first exhibition that we worked on, and so you can tell right off the bat we were interested in exactly this territory between editing, books, sort of curation, and then how you produce kind of a body of knowledge or speculation, let's say, out of it. And then we continued this interest in formats and in publishing practices in a show we did the next year called Newsstand, which was trying to capture what was then kind of suddenly a big moment where newsprint, specifically the broadsheet and various kinds of newsprint formats were suddenly coming back in architecture, and a lot of friends of ours and people we knew were using this format because it was cheap. You can print a lot of copies, you can sort of distribute them very effectively. A lot of it was being printed basically through one shop, which I'm sure you guys know. It's Linco in Brooklyn. Turned out to be kind of the big, a very, very large number of the people that we were talking to were all using that kind of, format. That's Mimi behind the newspaper. And so we did another exhibition where we collected basically about 30 or so examples from various people around sort of nationally that we knew, some international, that were using that format. So examples of their work that were free to take and to browse and sort of interact with. But then we also contributed by making our own newspaper. And so our newspaper was compiled out of a survey that we did with all of the people that contributed newspapers to the show, where we gave them a questionnaire about why do you use the newspaper format, what's interesting about it to you, and then the nuts and bolts of how much does it cost, what's the print run, what is this more effective than other ways of doing it. So this is the front cover, these are quotes that are compiled from that, and then descriptions of, and then all of the kind of questionnaire results from each one of these participants. And this was a kind of setup that this was part of a project that was ongoing then over those few months of that year at the new museum called the New City, it was part of an exhibition called The Last Newspaper. And it was called the New City Reader. So I put this in for Alan. So this is, and we have Alan Rapp to thank for bringing us in to work on that. And so basically you'll see Neil Donnelly did all the graphic design for all of the newspapers, which is why they looked incredible. And I also put this here in some way, maybe as a sort of pointer that, like one lesson for me in all of this is only ever work with your friends, especially if they all are totally great at what they do, which, we've been very lucky in that sense. So Mimi Zeiger, Irene Wang, Kilian Riano, and so we put together sort of a crew of people to work on the classifieds issue of these newspapers. And so the setup of the sort of call was that it was imagined as taking the sections of what had been a traditional newspaper and kind of splitting them so that each week would be, 1 week would be sports, 1 week would be lifestyle or culture, 1 week would be politics, or national or whatever. And the last week, I think, or second to last, maybe obituaries was the last week, which I think Moss did. And so we had some choice of which week we wanted initially, and we, with a group called Leagues and Legions, which included Mimi Zeiger and Enrique Ramirez and Chris Grimley and various other people, we specifically wanted the Classifieds Week, which is what we ended up doing because we were interested in the historical format of the Classifieds as the kind of back end of the newspaper, and as something that relied very specifically on format within. So we thought of it as the most, in a way, ephemeral part of an already ephemeral format, right? And it's one that actually has a very specific historical relationship to the existence of newspapers as such, right? In some way, I think our argument was that it in some way, it both kind of precedes and exceeds the format of the newspaper in some sense. So the first, flyers posting for wants and desires and sort of needs in the city were common well before they were then collected in the first broadsheets and then organized, which is to say classified. And there's a whole history of that. So I think the first New York Times, what became the New York Times, was 4 pages, and 1.5 pages were classifieds effectively, right? So there's a kind of promiscuous sort of history of these things as a motivator for the newspaper and its development as a format, and that takes on particular characteristics by virtue of being organized, classified in certain ways. And so we really took those formats and ran with them. So we basically compiled a whole set of actual classifieds. We recycled, we found and sort of redeployed classifieds from, for example, the Village Voice from 1969, sort of right at the sort of height of the sort of, like parents asking where their children are because their children have gone off to live in communes and things, and telling them they still love them. And, so it was both contemporary and historical, and we had some going back into the 1800s of actual examples of classifieds. And then within that, there was basically the result of a dialogue between all of us as contributors about the historical format of the classifieds and speculating on its future as a thing that would exceed actually the printed format of the newspaper, so Craigslist and that kind of thing. So that's sort of, part prelude, I guess. Just to put this out there, we'll come back to it later, but the other exhibition that we did for the first time at the same moment as we did publishing practices was called HeroiC, and this was a show about concrete architecture in Boston. I'll come back to it at the end of the talk, but this is just to kind of put it out there as the moment when we started to become interested in a certain body of historical material that we were very much invested in. So I was a native Bostonian who had returned. Chris and Mark were not native but had lived there at that point for about 10 years, and we were all sort of, for different reasons, we came together around a shared interest in concrete architecture as something that had been at that point especially less so now neglected, subject to active neglect or demolition, and that basically we found ourselves sort of interested in and confronting and wanting to kind of rescue a dialogue around around the history of these buildings. And so we did this show as the beginning of what we already at that point thought of as eventually producing a book. So the book is out in 2 weeks or a week or something, right? So this is 2009, so just to keep in mind the time frame of some of these things. But the exhibition was it was a sort of very quick and dirty way of showing the research as we had it at that point. So the research was, we were maybe 3-4 months into the research. And so this was, the idea was that it's a series of sheets. Each one is a sheet of a particular project with the kind of data, descriptions of them, quotes, contemporary quotes, etc., our photographs. And that each one is a stack, so they're hanging on hooks. They're just like 11 by 17 sheets, with hole punch on hooks. And the idea was that people could take away these sheets and take them out of the gallery and then read them and then leave them on the subway, and somebody might encounter a sheet about some building that they had never bothered to think about, and they walk by every day and might sort of see it in a new way, just to kind of put some stakes on the ground for what we might do later. And this was in this moment of kind of trying to insert some of this conversation in the stream of conversations that were already starting to happen in Boston. So there were these kinds of articles, like in praise of ugly buildings, the beauty of concrete, etc. And then the third one is ours. So we wrote an article in Architect magazine at the time, sort of trying to make a case for why we were interested in these things. And so we were basically kind of seeding the ground through various means. Sort of more journalistic formats, doing an exhibition, making maps. So this is a map sort of as we had it at the time. It's totally outdated now, of all of the concrete buildings we could find from that era in Boston. A website, which would also have similar information on these things and which we could use incrementally to build up over time. Twitter, right? So just kind of, building up a presence through all of these means and using them all equally as, and this is sort of before Instagram, and then we got on Instagram, et cetera, et cetera. And it worked. People really did take them and kind of, they started kind of filtering out, and we started to see things pop up in funny places as a way of putting down certain kinds of historical stakes, basically. So then we were, right after that, we were commissioned when the Boston Society of Architects opened their new gallery space in Boston, which was one of the first sort of dedicated institutional gallery type spaces. So we preceded that. When we started our gallery, there was very little operating outside of Harvard and MIT as the kind of typical two centers of discourse in Boston and Cambridge. And so when the BSA started what they called BSA space, they commissioned us to curate the first year and a half or so of their exhibitions as a way of kind of doing what we were thinking about already on a bigger stage. And so it gave us a different way of attacking some of this historical material and our interest in what was emerging pretty strongly as an interest in the post-war period in Boston, but also more broadly. So we did this exhibition. We opened their space with an exhibition basically about the history of Boston in the post-war period that was called Inform, the Legible City was kind of the subtitle. And it was a sort of different avenue onto the same window, let's say temporarily, of stuff, which was to revisit a sort of forgotten moment when legibility and a whole discourse around what was talked about as legibility. This is in the sense of Kevin Lynch, the image of the city and these kinds of things that were being published, was a very, very strong discourse in Boston among a lot of other cities that was producing really a whole range of projects that were aimed at remaking the way that one could use the city and sort of would use the city, often through means which were sort of architectural but also extra architectural. So graphic design, exhibitions sort of in the city that would communicate the city to its users, modernization of transit infrastructure, etc. Right. So this was you can contemporize it with things like the Vignelli redesign of the MTA system in New York. That there was a lot of sort of similar projects going on, and we wanted to kind of revisit and capture some things in that moment. And this was already starting to be the beginning of, let's say, in our self-analysis, a recognition that a large part of the reason that we were interested specifically in the post-war moment was because for us it started to represent a moment when architects and designers really had a strong role and were given a strong role in making claims on how the city and the built environment could work. And we saw that role was not nearly the same as it had been. This had been sort of the heyday of a certain kind of faith placed in the value of architecture, of design, and of designers to contribute meaningfully to problems in the city. It was also the era of civic funding before that ran out in the 70s. And so we were, there was a kind of reason we started to detect why we kept constantly going back to this set of interests and trying to argue for the value of a lot of this work that, unlike the concrete work, a lot of this was totally ephemeral. If one had not studied it, one would never have known that these things existed. So it was organized around 5 projects. These are quotes from the protagonists of the project at the time. 5 projects. I'll just go through them super briefly. So one was the modernization of the MTA. So this precedes the MTA Vignelli work. This is Cambridge 7, 1964 is when it started. And was the first comprehensive use of Helvetica unmodified, for example, in North America. Was the origins of this thing, the first version of what was called the spider map, this kind of abstracted map. Invented the name, the T in Boston, the logo of the T, invented the color scheme of the 4 lines, the red, the blue. This was all a design project sort of at the time to make the city more accessible by opening up its transit infrastructure, which had been notoriously dysfunctional and kind of quite illegible, sort of hard to read, and therefore hard to navigate and hard to kind of have access to the geography of the city. So this was, we developed a sort of system of kind of pixel walls of images that was sort of unearthing a lot of archival material and sort of redeploying it for the first time about the kind of bones of this design. And we built, so for each project we tried to have one sort of large artifact or kind of original object. And in cases where we couldn't have an original, like in this case, we built a model of the pilot station, Arlington Station in Boston, which was the pilot project for the comprehensive redesign of wayfinding and signage and graphics and all of these things, so that you could see all of the wayfinding and stuff sort of in the station as it played out. Project number 2 is an experimental information center from 1969 that existed for 1 month in Boston. as this kind of proto-cybernetic space that was intended to collect user data on how the city could function better, and had these kind of inflatables at the top. And so in this case, all we had was from one book, photographs like these and a few drawings, but not really. And we had to reconstruct it from scratch, including the color scheme. And so this is a model of our reconstruction of this sort of scheme, but it was an information sort of feedback loop that had a talk-back telephone that you could pick up and then record your feelings about what did or didn't work in the city, what you'd like to function better. It had a movie sort of a ticker tape, had an LED sort of map of the city with all sorts of info about architecture, like that would give you answers to questions like where is Le Corbusier's only building in North America? Super strange for the 70s. An exhibition called Where's Boston, which had a sort of Eames-like multimedia 3,000 slide projection cinema inside of it, but that basically narrated a kind of ethno-geographic series of stories about different city neighborhoods, basically. Here is our kind of replay of these images, sort of very large in the show. But then there was a certain move of trying to re-inhabit whatever the mediatic formats were that we were finding and investigating. And so we had slideshows that were running on these telex machines, which I had never seen before we found them for this show, it's like a TV screen with a slide projector on the top of it that bounces the image to the screen of the TV, so you can run them with remotes. It's basically a TV for viewing slides. We had all of the slides that were used in the slide shows, and then also slides about the project, but it was to give that sense of the sound of the clicking and the sort of crunch of the machines and all of that, to give you some sense of what it would have been like. An exhibition before the Big Dig was underway of archaeological excavations under the Big Dig, for which we did a lot of renovation work. This was by Kennedy Violich, and we did a lot of renovation work on an original model of the scheme from 1990, which is this. We had to pull out of a basement and rebuild sort of. That's then Governor Deval Patrick looking at the model. And then the last project was a project by a firm called Landing Studio in Boston that took an existing infrastructure in Chelsea, Massachusetts, which is a kind of sort of neglected area that saw itself as being cut off from the waterfront by this infrastructure of these salt piles, this is the point where road salt that gets salt that gets sprayed on the roads gets brought into the city and then collected in these huge piles. So Landing Studio took these snow piles, salt piles, and did a series of projections on them, and it was all about basically how do you turn a kind of disliked infrastructure into a kind of civic monument in a way, or monumental as it. And so we worked with them to build a salt pile with that actual salt in the gallery, and then have the back side of that was a whole global narrative about how salt arrives in the city and based on research they had done. And then of course, now that we had the secret to how to make newspapers, we just started, and we've done for every major show since then, making a newspaper, so a broadsheet also that became a big part of sort of how we tell the stories about these things. A next show we did, just continuing the set of interests, was called Futures, and this was about a single project, which was a proposal for a World's Bicentennial Exposition in Boston in 1970, to be built in 1976. The bicentennial year. The project is from about 1969. So this is Jan Wampler and a series of people in Boston working through the Boston Redevelopment Authority, which is the major development authority. That's the project. It is a megastructure that would have been built as a community for 30,000+ people on the water, sort of out onto the water in Boston. This is like a full-on sort of Kenzo Tange, Tokyo Bay type megastructure, which is unknown in Boston. People do not know that this was ever sort of it was a very real project. It was quite nearly built. It was a $1.2 billion project that was presented to a commission under the Nixon administration that was competing among cities to design a World's Bicentennial Expo. They were competing with Philly, and Washington, D.C. was kind of getting in as a late entry. and this was supported by the BRA, by city authorities, et cetera. So this quite nearly was built in Boston as a kind of utopian projection of an entirely new sector of the city. And so we did an exhibition that aimed to really produce a political chronology of the whole project from its origins to its endpoints. And this is sort of how it played out. So it was a compilation of sort of original materials, process materials, but also all of the newspaper articles through which this thing played out rather publicly in the Boston Globe. So we were re-inhabiting some of these formats and kind of reviving them. So this is, right, the drive to open the World's Fair, the expo that would add the model city, but also the images that we had from the architects of the process by which this thing was generated from beginning. So it's kind of like the rise and fall of this project. But by this point, we were already sort of, anytime we would do an exhibition of one of these things, there was an interest in the content, and then there was the set of questions about the format appropriate to it, or formats appropriate to it. And so any exhibition we were doing at this point, we were also thinking of as a book-like thing or as a publishable thing, and vice versa. Anything that we thought about publishing could also potentially produce an exhibition. And so sure enough, this was published in Mass Context as we worked with them shortly thereafter to also publish this chronology as in a more stable way, let's say durable way, as a publication, as part of one of their issues. And in a way, this is kind of the more appropriate, or let's say sort of proper home for this kind of thing, from its beginnings, from its origin, speculation about this kind of project, through the various politics, through the various options, to the opposition. This was from, not to put too fine a point on it, effectively racist, kind of provincial racist opposition from South Boston, which is a historically white community. And so Louise Day Hicks was the kind of major protagonist. She famously nearly won the mayoral election in 1968 in Boston on a segregationist platform. She was the head of the school committee at the time. So basically, they kind of killed the project because it would have included low-income housing and various other kinds of things that they didn't want in their neighborhood. But so we trace the whole history of this kind of its rise and fall through its kind of enmeshing in these various politics. And then later, as a sort of 2.0, we put together a travel sort of format for it, which is this thick plexi, sort of layered plexi table that also sort of outlays the same chronology, but in a way that we can now take to various different kinds of format. Just to finish up this part. So then at the same time, right, we had started a design biennial in Boston. And the first time that we were able, we had started it, I think 6 years prior to that, 4 or 6 years. The first time that we were able to display the biennial in Boston at the BSA, we took the opportunity to produce an archive, we called the show Archive, of all of the previous biennial participants and winners, and then accumulate some data about how architects practiced in Boston. And so you're starting to see some of the kind of ricochet effects of certain kinds of archival or sort of media interests that then cycle back into the exhibitions we do, and vice versa. So these are like poster, sort of flippable poster sort of compilations of work by all of the 19 previous biennial winners that then would direct you to these what we called arcs, which were full sort of drawers that you could pull out that would then have more information on each one of these on each one of the projects in depth, to sort of push it to a place where you could interact with it in a more direct way. And this was all backdrop for the installations by the 4 biennial winners in that year, which were sort of architectural interventions into the space. And then, of course, because we can't resist at this point, we published a book of it. So the Archive exhibition produced a book called Archive, which then has these data graphics that also they're sort of like cheeky, like somewhat illegible data graphics, because we were, I think, sick of the legibility of the like regime of Tufte at that point, and sort of wanted to resist in some way. So they're sort of arcane, but. So then a lot of this, for me, sort of jumping out of the pinkcomma bubble sort of for the moment, a lot of this came sort of into full effect when in working on OfficeUS. So I was the Associate Curator for OfficeUS, and so there was Eva Frank, Anna Miliachki, and Ashley Schaefer of Praxis were the three curators. And I worked with them on one specific part of it, but it's, and this is more sort of related to my interest in my other life as an architectural historian, which I won't get into here. But the exhibition was a history of office practice, architectural office practice in the US and its international extensions, and the work that was produced as a consequence through building a repository of the last 100 years of architecture built exclusively outside of the US by US firms. And this was kind of our attempt to invert the call that was put out by Rem Koolhaas for the Biennale at large, which was to look at the impact in the national pavilions, was to look at the impact of sort of globalization and modernization and modernism, whatever those were taken to mean, on sort of nationally, in national context. And so there was a kind of reception narrative, almost a critical regionalist narrative of the impact of a kind of generic, globalized sort of modernism in certain kinds of national contexts. And we felt like we had a different opportunity at the US Pavilion that was particular to the kind of US story, which was that we could flip it and talk about US architects exporting architecture, essentially building architecture everywhere else but the US, and build up a certain thickness around that. And so part one of the show, or one half of the show, was what we called the repository, which was this history of, it started with a number, a sort of admittedly arbitrary number, which was 1,000 projects that we were going to describe by over the 100 years of our time frame, 1914 to 2014. Part two was a live office that was, so the idea was that the pavilion would be set up like an office space, and that it would be inhabited by a live office of partners that were sort of collected, and then this would be both their office space. The repository would be both for visitors, but also would be their office library in some fashion, and that they would then kind of remake or redeploy or kind of revisit the history of the 100 years and the sort of operation for better or worse of US architects as well. That's them, that's sort of us and the office outside of the US Pavilion. And the idea was to really sort of build up an imaging of office-ness and of the office as a kind of entity, and an office in the metonymic sense, right? We were very interested in office as a term that has this double meaning of both the space of practice and a kind of institutional or bureaucratic entity that is called a firm or an office or a practice, right? So these kinds of spaces, so this is Frank Lloyd Wright, Taliesin, in a kind of staged photo with his collaborators. The classics like SOM, sort of in their offices in the Inland Steel building, which was also designed by them in New York in the 50s, or closer to my own interest, the Architects Collaborative in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right, 67. To kind of, these are all Ezra Stoller photos, to image the interior of that universe, sort of historically over the last 100 years, and also then the other side of the metonym of the bureaucratic sort of entity known as offices or sort of offices, from early models like Albert Kahn and Associates to SOM again, and sort of how they were organized, from the assembly line kind of model, the Fordist, quite literally Fordist model, to this kind of specialized hierarchical kind of decentralized model of SOM that was very much like 1950s organizations, up to the present. And so it was sort of not a big data project as such. It was maybe a sort of medium data project, which is to say that it was done largely manually. I mean, it was, I was the sort of director of research for this thing, and it was not really as data processing intensive as one. I mean, it really was basically historical research done by historians was the way of building it up. But it just meant a lot of stuff that there is no digital process to do it, right? You have to check a ton of footnotes and source everything and go track down all sorts of loose ends, historically speaking. And but out of which, once we had built up this data, I think we had a working database of about 2,300 projects at peak, from which we then whittled down curatorially to select a set of what ended up being the project. And then, given that data, we could then produce certain kinds of graphic representations. So this is an historical timeline of the 169 offices that were the producers of these projects from beginning to end. And then the dots are all of the projects they produced. So each one of these is an office. And you can see the ones that continue, the ones that get killed off. This is the Depression and World War II, et cetera. And then this is the geographical distribution of all of the projects. I think we had 675 projects that we ended up including in the space due to basically wall constraints, but it could easily have been so we never actually did the 1,000, but don't tell anyone. And it was, we were at that point sort of on our own front. We were looking at certain kinds of statements that were being made about curatorial work, curation, and specifically this kind of curation of archives, mediatic archives, and the idea of the exhibition as archive, which had started to become a very strong notion and has since become an even more prevalent one. Like this. So there was this kind of interview with Pedro Guadagno, who was then at MoMA, making these kinds of statements. Curating is the new criticism, that this was the kind of space for presenting a body of material and then in order to kind of reveal it, sort of lay it bare, critique it, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a certain interest in this, but to our way of thinking, you could have made an equally strong case that curating was the old criticism, right? Which is to say that this was not invented in that moment. There were lots of precedents, and for us, a particularly strong precedent curatorially for what we were going for, the line we were trying to sort of draw was Arthur Drexler, and specifically this exhibition, Transformations in Modern Architecture for MoMA from 1979. To my mind, one of the greatest things that ever happened at MoMA, which was basically a survey of the previous 30 years of architectural production, and was done solely through photography, no drawings, on the argument that the intent was to show the state of practice in its generic and diffuse and somewhat banal sense, mediocre in Drexler's terms, as it existed without any kind of dissimulation, and that it would be shown in the way that a building might appear to a layman in Drexler's terms, which is to say no architectural representations as such, no drawings, nothing that would only be legible to an architect. And so it was done as this kind of relentless wallpaper of black and white images that the viewer would be immersed in this way, and it was meant to be kind of to use certain curatorial tactics, including repetition, flattening, sort of leveling, multiplication, kind of sameness, homogeneity, et cetera, to amplify the argument of the show, which was about the taking of certain kind of canonical modernist ideas from the sort of first generation of what came to be known as modernism, and its widespread diffusion and kind of banalization in practice sort of at the time. So the ways in which certain things had become tropes or had become kind of standardized through this, to my mind, fairly brutal set of curatorial tactics of just kind of laying everything out. And it's a set of tactics that for me is even stronger in the catalog of the show, which does things like this. So it's organized basically purely formally into these kind of categories of, colonnade projects or glass skin projects of just, and it just groups like with like with like with like to show you in a way the repetition of these things in a quite sort of contentious way, and was criticized very heavily. A lot of critics didn't understand it, didn't sort of get the show. Or this, like this sort of, it all looks the same. It's all, everybody is trying to be unique. Everybody is doing the same thing. And we were similarly interested in this kind of sense of the good, the bad, and the ugly, really. So it was not about, it has been interpreted by some people, OfficeUS has been interpreted as like almost a kind of imperialist narrative about the strength of US architects and how great it is that they operate abroad. This was precisely the opposite intention. I mean, it was quite ironic and meant to be critical through the fairly careful selection of a lot of really problematic architectural projects, both in the sense of repetition of the generic, but also in the sense of deeply politically problematic projects. And things that pointed up certain kinds of geopolitical conditions in which U.S. architects were operating. So it was done as a media archive. That was our way of kind of building it up through collecting articles like this, right? This is from '75, the oil-rich Mideast, the new frontier for professional services. Is this the new client? These kind of sort of tense, anxious sort of moments that track work by US firms as they proliferated abroad, and the reactions to them, or sort of what they produce. So we lined the interior of the pavilion all the way around, this U-shaped pavilion, with these something like 850 books. It was the 169 offices plus the 675. I should do my math, but from the beginning, this was the beginning of the formation of a lot of these offices and their projects, sort of through the heyday of the post-war period and the building of, for example, Hilton hotels and US embassies, quite heavily through the period in which architects were working very heavily in the Middle East, in exactly that 1975 moment, particularly after the oil boom in '73. And then up to the present, and then you could see certain sort of things in the sheer accumulation of the work. So bigness, scope was, and sort of volume was a big part of it in order to thicken this kind of media archive. And you can see certain things like this just accumulation of this blue, this kind of particular blue that appears in the background of the images, which is largely a function of, both the kind of architecture of the buildings, but also the proliferation of towers, for example, and this kind of particular mode of photographing them. So certain sort of tendencies. And so it was designed to be a kind of thick media archive so each binder was either on an office or on the project that they had produced, and was a compilation of both documents, architectural drawings and things, but largely of media. So we tried to find every article published in North America, at least, or in the West, that we sort of had accessible to us on every single one of these projects. And so the folders would get thicker or thinner based on which project had been published more often and had more traction in the discipline. We had over 30,000 pages of printed material in total in this thing. And the idea was, in a way, to force a viewer to have to spend time with it. That you could get a quick kind of read of some type if you just kind of waltz through the gallery, but and a lot of the criticism, I should say, was seemed to have been done on that basis, that people didn't really look at what was in the folders. But it was really meant to kind of, in a way, shut down that impulse and require viewers in a potentially uncomfortable way to really look at this stuff and kind of inhabit the body of it. And then also the same was true for the partners of the office that would use it as, in a very direct way, as their office library, right? And that they weren't bolted to the walls or anything. You could take. The idea was that you could take them. That some of them got stolen, but not too many. As this kind of thickened sort of archive. And then, so just to play out a little bit the difference between doing that sort of thing as an exhibition and doing the same, then we turned around and had to do the same thing as a book. So this was OfficeUS Atlas, and I should say that Jeffrey Waldman and all of Pentagram were crucial in both the exhibition and the book, and put in a really untold amount of labor in sort of making these things, really giving them their shape and structure and appearance. But so we had then this problem of how do you take 30,000 pages of stuff that's meant to be relentless in a certain way in the space of a gallery, and then recurate in some fashion the entire thing as a book, as a 1,200-page book, where certain choices become sort of paramount. And so we, rather than, we knew basically it would have been deadly to just repeat the structure of the exhibition. What works as an exhibition does not work as a book, and vice versa. And so the book was structured around 20, I think, historical narratives that functioned something like chapters that started from the beginning, and some of these narratives were about offices and office practice, and some of them were broader narratives about export or about architects abroad or about particular places like China or the Middle East where architects were operating in certain periods, and that would be sequenced historically. They would each one, there was no sort of clean break between one section and the next. They weren't really quite chapters, but that they would each land at a certain historical moment when they would trigger suddenly in the book. So the narrative about oil, for example, lands at 1973 in the chronological sequence of the book. And that these are these kind of the time frame of each one of these narratives. And the idea was that this was Pentagram designed this very nice system so that this would be legible on the spine of the book, that you could actually read directly sort of where you were temporally. So the whole book is organized chronologically from 1914 to 2014, or actually from before 1914 in the office. And the general structure of a section of the book is sort of set up that way. So there's a kind of triggering of one of these narratives that appears. So this is the crude ideals, this is the oil one, with text, with a sort of description, and then a timeline of key political and other sort of events. This is that red that is legible on the spine, sort of telling you where you are. Certain kinds of data graphics where they were meaningful. So this is this is a map of all of the projects produced sort of on a timeline by U.S. architects in the Gulf states from 1945 to the first Gulf War, where they were located sort of by quantity, and then keyed to a graph of crude oil prices historically, right? So you can see basically when these things when the spike in crude oil prices happens, the same happens with the project. But the bulk of the book, and this was the major difference that you get out of these narratives, was articles. And so we made a kind of selection of the kind of greatest hits, in a way, of the mass of articles that had appeared in the repository that really was the kind of meat of the book. That would play out in each narrative section. We compiled a series of articles that would really speak to that kind of condition, and that would sort of operate on a different historical time frame, like this Americans Abroad, these kinds of, that's the same, oil-rich Mideast article, Partners in Growth. This is all from that one section, right? So the idea was that it became really a kind of media reader, that the bulk of the 1,200 pages, I think something like 800 out of the 1,200 pages, are basically a reader of historical articles that go all the way back into the late 19th century, through which all of these things play out. And also as a kind of register for the particular formats of all of this mediatic stuff through which these projects were being negotiated and advertised and described, often in a kind of advertising sort of way. Right? Middle East construction, American designers in Arabia. And supplemented by descriptions of most of the 169 offices that had produced them. And so the thing that got suppressed in all of this, and this is the crucial difference sort of with the exhibition format, were the projects themselves. Because we decided that if you replayed the kind of relentless format of the exhibition, you'd end up with like a telephone book. It was the kind of what we called the telephone book problem, and you didn't want to have that. And the way to do it was really to push down all of this kind of stuff to what ended up being very, very few pages of this kind of compressed format, so that it really, the media portion of it sort of became evident. And then, how am I doing on time? 10 minutes, okay, I'll fly through this one. So this is to get to, what we all want to talk about, which is heroic. And then, an extension of a lot of, let's say, lessons learned in OfficeUS, or sort of things that we were still kind of, that I've been hashing through since my involvement with that we just have just had a chance to kind of play out in an exhibition that opened in Pittsburgh a couple of weeks ago, that we curated at, Chris, Mark, and I curated at the Heinz Architectural Center. It's part of the Carnegie Museum, called Imagining the Modern. So this is a return back to, this is post-war, but now post-war Pittsburgh. And we thought, in a sort of jokey way, we thought about it, not quite as heroic Pittsburgh, but, as a sort of different thing. But it was for us, again, a return in a different venue with a different set of historical conditions to the post-war period, and a similar attempt to build up a kind of thick media archive of the various histories and then debates that played out around a lot of the urban renewal era in Pittsburgh. As a city that, one of the cities that transformed itself the most heavily through urban renewal, through these kinds of projects, the Gateway Center, Civic Arena, all of this is now demolished, through a series of both built and unbuilt projects. So this is Civic Arena was built, this IMP sort of project was partially built, SOM Cultural Complex was never built, etc. Frank Lloyd Wright's Point Park proposals for these kind of mega structures, speculated on, never built. So there was a whole set of ideas swirling around, but that contained an enormous amount of media, again, that we wanted to reopen for the public in Pittsburgh, in order to kind of come back to a middle ground where you could have certain debates about the legacy of urban renewal, which is seen there as here, as in Boston, generally as almost entirely negative, but in which we saw that there was a lot that needed to be revisited. It was a specific quality of the Pittsburgh work as opposed to the heroic work you'll see in Boston, that it was not concrete. It was emblematic of the different material producers in Pittsburgh as a kind of industry town, which is to say aluminum, Alcoa building, Alcoa builds its headquarters in aluminum, which is the material that it produces. Gateway Center is in aluminum. The world's longest, steel span retractable auditorium. That's Alcoa, right, et cetera. U.S. Steel builds its buildings in steel, Pittsburgh plate glass in glass, et cetera. So the exhibition carries through some things, actually, that you could say sort of I dealt with, first to some extent in the OfficeUS work. It's organized in a series of kind of media rooms. So there's this long corridor that has general national urban renewal history, and then sort of the major sites of intervention in Pittsburgh and description of those, and then 3 rooms that were organized by media type. So photography was this one, documents was this one, and then this was a film room with these tripods as this kind of system that could be sort of organized vertically or horizontally to take different kinds of information. And then a salon, what was a studio. There's a design studio being taught at Carnegie Mellon that's functioning out of this space. In the first semester, this shows up, and then in the second semester will become a salon for events and things where students, again, can basically physically operate in the gallery. This is the corridor with these boards that describe the different sites and that overlay built and unbuilt work. So this big round thing is the Frank Lloyd Wright Point Park proposal, sort of overlaid with the Gateway Center and things that actually were built, and then drawings of each one of them, et cetera, that kind of set up the major territories of intervention, or the Civic Arena site in the lower hill. And then just a quick tour through the rooms. This is the photography room. And there was a certain setup that, so this is, again, you can see sort of transformations in modern architecture and some of the OfficeUS work kind of now triggering again. The tripods in this room contained all of the descriptive information about the photographers whose work was on display, and then the wallpaper along the edges of the room contained really the bulk of their work in this kind of, and it was dense enough that you need these separate sort of sheets that give you all of the captions to each one. This is the documents room, which had a mix of archival documents from various libraries and other sources sort of under glass, and then these arcs, which were these are the same arcs from the same arc system that we used in the biennial, sort of coming back, so sort of descriptive content, and then arcs which have a lot of contemporary magazines and things, Life magazine and things that are not under glass. These are just things that people can pick up. We bought them for people to just pick up and read and use, and they're probably going to be totally destroyed by the end of the exhibition, but we just sort of accept that as a consequence, versus things like issues of Charette Journal, which was the architectural journal in Pittsburgh. And then finally the film room, which has this loop of films about urban renewal, mostly short films that were sort of contemporary at the time, and a lot of them are totally hilarious, but also kind of informative. And it was basically, the idea was to give visitors as many different avenues for interpretation as possible, and as many ways of accessing the content, and basically that if you put in a rich enough spectrum of material, certain things would trigger for certain people and other things for others, right? And so in the documents room, there's also, these are all newspapers, contemporary newspapers in Pittsburgh on a chronological timeline, in which all of these debates were playing out about the demolition of neighborhoods and who was affected by that, versus national architectural press and trade press like Fortune magazine. And then the salon, sort of, which was the only room where we had original architectural drawings as a sort of form of media that was then going to be legible to the students that were operating out of the architecture studio, and that would be specifically of interest to them, as a kind of thing that would surround them when they produce their work. So so it's both originals and reproductions. Okay, so I'll wrap up by just sort of giving a preview of the, our baby, the thing that is now physically exists but comes in bookstores in the next, week and a half or something. October 27th, I think is the date. HeroiC. So now, at the tail end of all of this, having started the HeroiC project in 2009, through an exhibition and then a series of little exhibitions that we did afterwards, it's now kind of come full circle. And really, this is thanks to Alan Rapp and Monacelli Press for taking it on and sort of shepherding it through all of its phases, and sort of allowing us, after many years to really make it into a reality. I'll probably skip over most of the historical stuff because we got it by now, basically, that we're interested in post-war period in Boston specifically. As Boston was again one of the cities that remade itself the most heavily. It was the last time there was a comprehensive master plan in Boston. There's supposedly going to be a new one for 2030, but a lot of this work was built sort of within the context of a fairly robust master plan that determined if you can match this up to that map of concrete buildings, and it's an almost exact overlay in many cases of what precipitated this kind of work. That was circulating very heavily in the media, so you can't read that, but it says Government Center, symbolic showpiece of a new Boston. This is a special issue of Architectural Forum. Again, you can see how much there's a kind of restaging of different kinds of media, architectural media, magazines, newspapers, etc., constantly, and a lot of these things, both in book formats and in exhibition formats, as a kind of replay, as a way of sort of making them do work again, I guess. And revisiting some of the characters that were notorious in this, not least Ed Logue, the head of the Boston Redevelopment Authority. So, Boston's bold gladiator, there he is. There's sort of our, the man himself. I'll spare you the Hitler reference that is being made in this. Maybe I won't, I don't know. Right, so this is Catherine Craven, who's also a member of the school board. This is in the same article. Life magazine once said, the resemblances between Logue and Hitler are striking. So there's this kind of villainizing of these characters, and we wanted to, again, it was, the goal of the book was to it was basically to take a set of historical material whose interpretation has skewed increasingly negative in the decades since, as is the case in Pittsburgh, and not to go to the other end of the spectrum and say it was all great and wonderful and with sort of rose-colored glasses, but really to bring things to a middle point where a lot of the nuance and tenor of those debates can be found again and can be argued for sort of anew, for right, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as it were. And to revisit then the sites, the transformative sites of this government center, but also the transformative buildings, not least of which is frequently cited as the most hated building, ugliest building in North America, is Boston City Hall, which we love. Right, and so the major mechanism for doing this was to not use the term brutalism, because this was like decision number one, so this was already baked into the project from its very earliest stages, was that we could have, and we do in the introduction to this, to the book, write about it, we could have revisited and really tried to restore a lot of the nuance to the term brutalism, the intentions behind the use of that word in the 1950s, its origins, and the ways in which brutalism was meant to have a kind of double sense, both of kind of toughness and authenticity and honesty about the social conditions of its time, but also imply certain things about the aesthetics of the building. But it was not meant to sound the way that it became later. So these kinds of quotes, brutalism tries to face up to a mass production society and drag a rough poetry, out of the confused and powerful forces that are at work. But we decided that had proven to be a dead end so many times that really it was just the word had become totally over-determined. People just couldn't get past it. It's really kind of branding-wise at the level of rhetoric, like the worst name you could possibly have given to an architectural movement in retrospect, because it just sort of, the valences of all of these things shifted to the point where brutalism cannot connote to most people anything other than brutal, oppressive, demeaning, dehumanizing, sort of meant to make you feel tiny and insignificant and awful, and produces a certain kind of rhetoric that these buildings were designed with out of bad intentions, or that urban renewal was entirely conducted out of bad intentions. And we just thought, let's not fight that fight. Let's pick a new word, and a word that, again, for us is not entirely positive. It's a word that was meant to restore, in a way, some of the ways that the term brutalism was originally intended to operate, which was heroic, which has this other lineage it was also a word that was circulating in these conversations, but it tends to be forgotten now, right? So the Smithsons were directly invoking their sort of predecessors as what they called the heroic period of modern architecture at the same time, and they cite the heroic struggle that gave us a sense of moral responsibility to invent for ourselves forms appropriate to our own time, etc. It was also used negatively by Venturian Scott Brown, famously in Learning from Las Vegas, right? This is not the time and ours is not the environment for heroic communication through pure architecture. So the heroic was against the ugly and the ordinary, which they were in favor of. It's interesting that ugly is on the other side of that, but that's another conversation in terms of the interpretation of these buildings, right? And so we just thought, heroic for us had this double meaning, again, of hubris, of kind of overreach, and of the tragic hero, but also of the kind of optimism and social ideals of the time. And just to sort of bring it back to the media question, or the formats question, so we were able to realize this book quite largely through this Kickstarter campaign, which I'm sure all of you guys know about, and a lot of you contributed to, and we owe you your books. And just to note that we thought about the Kickstarter campaign not solely as a money-making thing, but we thought about it as another media component of the reality of this project, and one that was kind of important to us because it gave us an outlet for really generating another kind of discussion on another platform about concrete, about this kind of work, about the intentions of the project through media that we hadn't produced yet. So, we made a film, a short film, which is sort of one of the things you do, and it really turned out to be sort of taken as publicity and a way of generating a kind of discussion, a really nice platform sort of on its own terms. We're big Kickstarter fans. Anyway, so there's the book, and so this is my sort of reveal. I should say that the cover, it's probably true that we were channeling these sorts of contemporary covers of these sort of overlays of, concrete buildings. Like this is a special issue on Sarah Jackson Gourley that, was designing a lot of them, or Architectural Forum, 1969. And so the book is organized in 3 parts. Part 1 is essays by us and by architectural historians that revisit sort of facets that bring you from, so Joan Achman, Elizabeth Cohen, Douglas Shantucci, Keith Morgan, that bring you from the global story of brutalism, so through Great Britain and France, to root it in the Boston sort of case, and then look at, for example, the Boston Redevelopment Authority as the institution behind all of this. Part 2, which is the bulk of the book, the kind of meat of the sandwich, is case studies of 23 significant buildings, the sort of best of the buildings, even though our list that produced that map you saw earlier had over 200 buildings on it when we stopped working on it. These are sort of with axonometrics that we drew for each one of the ones that we included. And then these are organized into a series of kind of subsections that are sort of the Civic Center, which is Government Center, the central site of all of this, and then some of its buildings like Boston City Hall. And again, so this is where, this was done in the more, let's say, traditional sense as a book of really having to find and source and research a really tremendous amount of archival material, much of which has never been published, write texts about buildings which have never actually been described and are rather little understood. City Hall is not one of them, but so some of this is known, and really just incredible material. And then sort of play it out in the book. Universities as the major drivers of work in this period, Harvard, MIT, but also Boston University. That's the photo that the cover is based on. Design culture, which was really about spaces in Boston. There were a significant number of spaces that were sort of made by architects, artists, designers for themselves in a way, as places of teaching, living, working. And there was a very strong culture of this sort of office environments, teaching environments, which included things like the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts by Le Corbusier, his only building in North America. But also things like the Boston Architectural Center, which was the only dedicated night school for architects then and now in the US, designed by architectural competition at the same time as Boston City Hall, etc. And office environments like the Architect's Corner, which was sort of the central site on which the Architects Collaborative and a lot of other firms worked, and is emblematized by this kind of luminous vitrine of design research, which I'm sure you guys all know all about. And something that's particularly satisfying for me in this project, among the things that we were able to put back on the table, is a series of houses by Mary Otis Stevens that she did together with her partner Thomas McNulty, sort of in the 60s, fairly radical experimental concrete houses that were experiments in domesticity, in basically a total rearrangement of notions of domestic space, family space, living and working, that are really not known. And so this was their own house and studio, which is the only house that's been published at all, is now demolished. But there were 3 other houses that had they never appeared anywhere. They have literally never been published anywhere in any architectural journal ever, due to various prohibitions sort of by the clients of the houses that we were able to include in a kind of minimal way, but really, things that don't play in the normal narrative. And other lesser known projects that were built in the course of the master plan, like there's a Marcel Breuer High School in Roxbury in Boston, which nobody knows about, but which is incredible, right? This kind of project, and which has a rather complicated political history, right? And then the last part of the book, just to wrap up, is interviews, right? With these great quotes. I think if we could have done it, we would have used concrete to make the light switches, And interviews with a lot of the protagonists of the time, the architects that were building the work. And these were fascinating for us to do. And so a lot of this is substantially new content. So it's both archival material and textually new writing, new interviews, new historical essays, etc. We interviewed Mary Otis Stevens about her work, and she was rather critical of the term heroic for various reasons. And we included in the interview, in the transcript that appears in the book, her criticisms of our own naming of the book, etc., as a kind of nuancing of the whole thing. And so, thanks to Kickstarter, the next part of this, now having wrapped up the book, because we're totally restless and we just can't sort of leave well enough alone, so the next part of it now is to go back into the web format and try and put together really a web site that will, or a web platform that will function like a database. That's both for the information that we've been able to build up, but also will be a site for other people to post information about these buildings and basically open it up, now to a whole set of other information. And so in a way, everything comes back to sort of where it started. And, you would think that having produced this, we would sort of take a break or something, but apparently we are not good at doing that. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was fantastic and amazing to see the body of your work. I mean, it's so impressive. So it sort of relates to my first question for you. I'm going to just ask you a couple of questions and give the mic over to the audience for a few questions. But I think almost all of the projects you showed were collaborations. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about why you seem to value collaboration so much. I mean, you're doing a Ph.D., which is a fairly independent endeavor on its own, and I'm sure you're working on that in solitude some of the time. But otherwise, you're doing very highly collaborative projects and probably herding cats to some degree.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. That's a good question that immediately comes up in all of this, and it's partly because the collaborators are different in different projects. You guys can hear me? Yeah. The collaborators, in a lot of cases, it's Mark and Chris and me in the work that I showed, but not in the case of OfficeUS. And there's a whole other lecture to be given on architectural stuff that I've been involved in, which is a different set of collaborators. And I guess I should preface it by saying, sort of coming clean and saying that the dissertation is about collaborative and corporate architectural practices and kind of the origins of a certain discourse around that, specifically after World War II in the US. And the funny thing is, I mean, you could do psychoanalysis on me after the fact, and I'd probably have to just kind of accept it, but it wasn't, the one didn't produce the other, and I never thought of them as being being directly related. In other words, it wasn't that I was interested in that on the academic front and then decided to test anything live, on the sort of other front, or the reverse. It wasn't that I had been sort of working collaboratively and then wanted to pick that apart on the academic front. It really was partly to do with circumstances, and partly, I think, it at some point it started to become very productive and interesting for me to just have a lot of spillover space, which is to say, you you get used to doing certain kinds of work in certain kind of spaces, academic spaces or otherwise. But there's always this spillover stuff that you can't do, like you can't do it in the body of your dissertation, or this book won't accept it, or it's sort of, things that kind of exceed whatever the current project is. And working with various collaborators started to produce these weird ricochets where something could just kind of migrate over and produce an exhibition, and you could kind of hash it out in some portion of your brain there, and then something from an exhibition could then kind of filter over and then start working. You could then decide you were going to produce an article that you were going to publish, or, and you could sort of let things go where they went, and then everybody had different strengths in that kind of process, I guess, right? And this was, so it's, it's been collaborative, but it's also been very significantly collaborative with people that have a lot of different skills, like it was has been tremendously to our benefit at pinkcomma that we're like one-stop shopping for, different kinds of things. And it's basically because between Mark and Chris, Chris is an excellent graphic designer, and we can sort of do everything. I mean, Chris designed the book, and it was like, I don't know, too good to be true in some sense, that you could just run with it. And it's given me a lot of stuff that I can just sort of feed back from one thing into another and kind of not worry about it too much.
You use archival media in such an interesting way for so many of your projects. And I was just wondering if you might be able to comment on the relationship of architects to media, since you've got this longer historic view of how architects have interacted with media or been covered by media or affected media. And do you see any trends emerging historically, say from 20th century and between architects and media?
I mean, I would say...
Are architects more media savvy?
Then, you mean other disciplines?
Today? Well, I mean, between other disciplines, or more so today than they might have been previously, or they're stand out?
Yeah, I think I would argue that it's been pretty consistently a part of the disciplinary definition of architecture from the beginning of what, came to acquire the term, which is really, I mean, the disciplinary sort of figure of the architect is to some extent a Renaissance invention, and kind of afterwards versus things that would have been called master builders or sort of other things before that. And on the longer historical trajectory, it's fairly possible to say that certain media formats, I mean, the invention of kind of architectural drawing as we understand it today was part of that, but also the invention of particular formats, not least of which was the printed book, right? So the printed book kind of emerges at exactly the same moment, and so there are a lot of deep historical relationships between all of those things, and so it's what really kind of constitutes, I mean, in my argument anyways, the figure of the architect as a thing that was distinct, that was more affiliated with the liberal arts, for example, and away from what had been seen as a kind of guild practice or master builder, was to a large extent flowing through the printed book, literary formats, the acquisition of certain kinds of drawings that would circulate through prints and then increasingly through books and things. And those are, so they're absolute, and so I think it's kind of built in from the beginning that basically an architect was one who operated through media, who published quite literally in certain ways, and then became very savvy about their representation as they circulated through all of these things. And that's, I think, it's mutated. I mean, it's taken on sort of every new format that emerges. I think it might be possible to say that architects have been, among the better disciplines at kind of latching onto and seeking to understand and snapping up different formats as they kind of mutate, and it just reappears, like the avant-garde magazines of the 20s and 30s, and sort of all of these moments where architects are kind of on it very quickly. But I think that the mentality has been fairly present for at least something like 500 years.
Just minus 500. Let's take some questions from the audience before we convene for drinks. So Lorena's going to pass the mic around to anyone who has a question.
Hi. My question might be a bit close to the one that Molly just asked, but it's you talked a lot about archive and archiving and archival material. So how, in your opinion, is the exhibition format a good one for archival contents in general?
Well, it's good. I mean, I think we found in some of these that it was good, sort of on the one hand in the dumb sense that you can just have physically a lot more stuff. You can have like an order of magnitude more stuff than you can have in this. You know, for example, this, you know, editing of something like this is, you know, becomes a very selective process of only ever being able to include a minor amount of the total quantity of stuff that you find, and having to make very particular assessments of, you know, the one image out of the set of 20 or something. And in an exhibition that, in some cases, if done a certain way, that's a little bit better. I mean, in the sense that you can show, you know, 10 images rather than one or something. I mean, money notwithstanding, which is another issue. But I think it's meant that we can also kind of thicken certain things at points, like having a binder where we have 200 pages in it suddenly of just kind of replay of things, or that you can have those you know, arc drawers where you can have then, you know, you don't have to allude to or describe an issue of Life magazine. You just buy the issue of Life magazine off of eBay, and then you just have it there. You know, that there's a certain directness of how you can have access to stuff, but it induces all sorts of other things. I mean, like that, you know, I could describe the way that the distinction between the things that had to be under glass in cases and the things that we were capable of allowed to put within the drawers was, there were all sorts of things governing that, and source-wise, and, you know, there's a certain, our interest in a lot of cases was to create access to, sort of open things up and create as much access to them as possible. But then, and, you know, one way of thinking about it for us had been, when you go from a book where, you know, real estate is really precious to an exhibition format where, you know, real estate is precious, but it sort of plays in a different way, that you can do that much more, but then it suddenly triggers all these other things, that suddenly there are other things about objects and their care in a curatorial space that suddenly, you know, become thorny issues on their own sort of front, you know?
Great. Any other questions from our audience?
I'm interested to hear your take on the current kind of trajectory of critical regionalism in Boston, and how your work either fits into that or contrasts with that.
Can you say more about that? Critical regionalism?
Well, yeah, I mean, your work seems to be rooted a lot in post-war. What is the current state of Boston and the landscape of Boston? Is there a presiding critical regionalism in Boston now? And, you know, do you see it going in a particular direction, or is there not?
I mean, it's you know, there are good positive signs and less positive signs, I guess. There's one of the reasons for starting pinkcomma back in the day was out of this feeling that there actually was a community to be found of young, interesting architects that wanted to do interesting things, but that they didn't have a lot of opportunities but to do work, but also opportunities really to be visible, to show themselves and talk about themselves, but also talk with others, right? And so we started the gallery as a way of basically trying to pull together a certain community and give them a space to operate. And there's been a lot more, there's been a lot more sort of done on that front, you know, by lots of different people in Boston, that's helping to some extent with the problem that we found of people studying in Boston and then moving out of Boston almost immediately when they graduate, out of the sense that Boston wasn't really a place to you know, where one could do good work, as a place that since this era has been a fairly conservative, not to say boring, okay, maybe boring, building town. I mean, just to a large extent, right? That this kind of heyday, and that's kind of why we go back to this stuff a lot, because we just look at it and we just think, how the hell did they ever build that in Boston? How was the climate, the discourse and the climate and the opportunity there to do these kinds of things that are not possible now? On the work front, there are sort of two conversations, I think, that are happening now in Boston in parallel, and it's tricky to connect them. On the one hand, there's a building boom. I mean, there have been a lot of articles and things playing up the amount of construction that's going on as being equivalent to sort of, not since this era has there been that much work being done in Boston. But on the other hand, there's a parallel argument from us and various other people saying it's disproportionately sort of corporate stuff that's going to a handful of really big kind of uninteresting offices, and that it's precisely younger designers that are not being involved in that conversation, among many other constituencies that are also not involved in those conversations. And that there's been a call for broader frameworks, once again, in which to have those kinds of conversations. And so there are a lot of positive signs from the mayor's office that, we went from Mayor Menino, who for about 20 years was constantly calling for the demolition of Boston City Hall and, professed to hating the building, to the current mayor, Walsh, who is actually investing a certain amount of care and interest in sort of reviving the building. And it's under Walsh that there's been the push for this Boston 2030 plan that would be the first comprehensive plan in 50 years. There was the kind of misfire of the Olympics, which, if done a certain way, could have, in my mind, produced a broader set of conversations about planning, sort of at the scale of the city, but hopefully will be. So in other words, there are sort of good signs and bad signs, or there are things that are potentially good if used in a certain way, given that there's a lot of work happening, but have yet to be, I think, connected up a little bit to various kinds of constituencies that are basically calling out to be a part of that in a way that they were, sort of as a matter of course in that era, and not so much, still not so much since then, I think.
Great. So let's take one more question. Yeah.
Ladies first.
Okay. Sorry, Neil.
Hi. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the section on the Middle East that you showed, and it seemed as if you were implying some sort of ethical kind of situation around that.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, no, you're good to point that out, because I was also thinking the same thing suddenly, that I was sort of putting a cast on it that I actually don't normally put on it. So that I should say that that's actually targeted, that's tied to stuff that's happening in my dissertation on the other side of things. There are a couple of chapters that go into specifically the involvement of U.S. practices that become increasingly large and increasingly what later will be described as corporate architecture practices, largely to do with their involvement in the Middle East after the 1950s, basically, but quite heavily in between 73 and 83 is the sort of crucial time frame. And I don't mean to imply at all that involvement as such had any particular ethical cast. There are lots of specific cases where, and I tell some of those political stories in the dissertation about particular engagements with capital, with oil capital, and with certain volatile finance economies of speculation that are then built on top of that, and that have certain ricochet effects in Kuwait, which is what I'm sort of looking at more heavily. But I didn't mean to sort of say that over the entirety, sort of involvement as such was a negative. It's I just meant it there as a kind of what we thought of as one of the most kind of interesting moments in these series of narratives that we were interested in OfficeUS, sort of that would kind of rise up sort of like in waves over the course of the chronology of this thing, without calling them out sort of quite as explicitly as we do in the book. because it was a moment when suddenly you can just see a lot of dynamics sort of almost happening just like before your eyes, just in the chronology of which architects were working and where they were building and what kind of stuff they were building visually almost, that you can just see a certain whole economic and political and cultural set of stories kind of coming up and then playing out, that then we could go into more depth, with articles and things like that. And it was just a kind of moment of, where that became really legible versus other stories that took us a lot more work to make sure that they were somehow able, that people could register them, But the Middle East story was like almost, without us having to curate very much at that point, certain things like the color spectrum of all the projects on the wall in Venice changed suddenly into this particular kind of like orange, yellow, kind of like desert colors that was just in the photographs of the buildings, etc. Right?
Do you see any relationship between what happened then and what's happening now as far as building?
I mean, yeah, sure. Yes. I mean, it's, so the work there and basically the parts of that that are coming into my dissertation are in a way about setting up a certain prehistory of some things that happened. And so it ends before 1990, it ends sort of in the mid 80s, those sets of narratives. And so it doesn't directly make connections to what happened after 1990, but those connections are meant to be implicit or kind of tentative there as a way of then being able to take on, what then end up being sort of related, but on their own terms, rather sort of different stories about what happens in places like the Emirates, so sort of after. I mean, the sites of work shift, and so a place like Kuwait, Kuwait was like the Dubai of the 70s. I mean, Kuwait was a place that was really kind of at the center of the boom in the 70s, but then not in the 90s. In the 90s, it sort of shifted to Abu Dhabi and Dubai and sort of other places. So there are certain kinds of major shifts, but a lot of the stories pop up sort of again and again. And it was part of the general idea of the OfficeUS work was that there are various dynamics of some of those stories that are not tied to a specific geography and actually that pop up. It's as true of missionary projects in China and Japan in the 1920s and 30s as it is in the Middle East in the 70s, or as it is in Europe in the 50s, or India and Pakistan in the 60s. I mean, there are certain places where a certain set of interests of U.S. architects and then how those engage with various kinds of geopolitics, it's like you can see kind of the same, certain similar kind of trends, and then you can stake out the differences of each one of those kind of within that in a historically nuanced way, let's say.
So let us continue this conversation over drinks next door. And before we get up, let's give Michael another round of applause for his excellent talk.